So today we're going to be talking about, this is part 2 of the virtualization on Lync Server 2013. We're going to go into more of the testing and deployment. How many of you guys were in Campbell's session yesterday? We talked about planning and architecture. A couple of you?
A couple of you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try not to be too redundant in this, but there will be some overview for the people that didn't make the session yesterday. So we're going to talk about specifically sizing your environment, kind of what are the scaling units that you should be mindful of for the different roles for Lync, and then also the stress tool itself. We're going to go into some of the configuration notes. This will be a little review from yesterday's session on specifically Hyper-V or hypervisor. And then we're going to go into deploying the stress tool. So we'll talk about the configuration of the stress tool. I'll actually do a small demo of what the tool looks like, and then show you some of the things that we noticed when we were doing our testing in the configuration, things that you might want to take a look at.
How many people know about the stress tool, the Lync stress tool? Just show of hands there. Yeah, it's interesting. Interesting. It's probably like a 50-50 split, I think I saw there.
Yeah,
it's
not bad.
That's actually pretty good. Thank you.
And then we'll switch gears into testing. This is a smaller section. Once you get everything set up and deployed and configured, running the test there's not a whole lot to it, and then we'll also look at some of the things you look at after you do your testing, and how you set up good performance logs and things like that to take a look at how your health is. All right, let's go ahead and get started into deployment. So sizing your environment. So these are the 3 guests that we'll be using, and the 3 guests that we actually used in our testing when we built this out and tested it for the white paper that was published yesterday. Hopefully everybody knows that white paper got published yesterday.
So everyone know that? It was tweeted and social networked and...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm taking lots of notes. Great.
Yeah, there were 2 white papers. So there was the first one, which goes over more about what Campbell Gunn talked about yesterday, and then there's a testing guide, which kind of goes into some of what I'm going to talk about, and then just some of the config notes as well. So you can see we have 3 main guests here. We have the smaller guests, which you'll see is more for the testing tools. We have kind of a mid-size, which is the 8-core 16 gig, which is for some of the smaller roles in Lync. And then the larger guest, the 12-core 32 gigabyte, which is more for your front ends and back ends. So if we take a look at this big guest, you can see front ends, back ends, and the standard edition servers use this. There was a question in yesterday's session about whether the back ends use 16 or 32. So just to clarify, they use 32. Yep. In Lync 2010, it was 16. So I apologize for that. There's show a correction here. You can see these guests. How many of you are familiar with just the recommended hardware, physical hardware for Lync? I imagine most of you are. So you can see this mimics that. I mean, we recommend 2 hex core procs. We're talking about 12 cores that we're going to use for this guest, 32 gigs of RAM, 2 disks, 2 for C, and then 4 for D. In our lab testing, we used 15K. I know in the hardware recommendations, it recommends at least 10. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's 6 for the D drive on 10K. We only used 4 because we were using 15Ks. And then obviously this would change a little bit if you're using SSDs or depending on what your the actual hard drives that you're using in your Hyper-V hosts. These can change. The main thing, and if you look at the white paper, is looking at the IOPS. The IOPS are really the key and the key requirement. So if you look at that white paper, it'll actually show you what IOP expectations are for the front ends specifically, which is where the real cycles are going to be needed.
We also had that in the presentation yesterday.
Yes.
The IOPS.
Yeah, so when the recordings come out, you can also take a look at that, and we'll go over what those IOP requirements are. So the second one is we use for edge servers. We didn't have directors in our test, but you may have directors. You may want to test directors. And so it's good to know that these two roles really have the same guest requirements. And again, this is the same hardware requirements you would see if you were deploying physical servers. We're just mapping that to virtual guests. And then lastly, we have this smaller guest that we use for our stress agents. And again, this mimics the physical hardware, so this would be the same if you were deploying physical agents in your test environment.
Just to add, you can use both. There is a significant amount of stress agents you need, so make sure that you factor that in so you can see the performance aspects of, and that's where all the work is coming from to the user pools. We used virtualization. It was just easier than having physical clients, physical agents running out there. So just bear that one in mind.
So we'll kind of go into some of what Campbell's talking about here. So front ends, at least in the virtual environment, that we saw about a scaling unit of about 33 users per front end. This is connected users. This isn't provisioned users. So it's good to note that we're talking about concurrency here. We're not talking about how many users you actually have provisioned in your environment that may or may not be logging in. Then we have our backend. Your backend's really going to scale for your pool count. So you're going to max out your front ends. Who knows how many front ends you can have in a pool? Anyone? 12?
10.
So in our case, we're looking at more like a 40,000 user pool here because of the virtualization testing. It's good to note that these calculations are based on our actual testing in our environment, on the hardware that we had, and the disk configurations we had. And so this will change based on what hardware you actually put towards your virtual environment. You might be able to get more users, or you might be able to get less users. The other driving factor here is your usage. What's your usage profile look for your users? Are they heavy AV conferencing users, or are they just IM and presence users? If they're just IM and presence users, you're probably going to be able to push this number a lot higher. But if they're using the service quite a bit, then you're not going to be able to maybe get as many. Question? I'll actually demo that. Thank you. So edge servers, again, from our scaling perspective, these are going to scale with the pool count. And so you're going to have generally an edge server or media relay, more specifically, that you're going to pair with the pools that you have. And it would be a good idea to have a media relay per your pools if you're scaling out beyond one pool. Question?
I just want to refine that. I guess what I was asking is there anything we run as our QoE or something to determine what our users are really doing? We can guess that they're using this conference back on to IM, but we don't really know. So we are going to determine what our average user load looks like.
Yeah, so actually determining what your user load looks like is, like you said, QE is not going to be able to give you too much. It's going to be more on the health side, but CDR data is really going to be where your usage data is. And I mean, the things you're going to want to look at that are going to drive resources on the service is going to be things like connected participants in conferences. How many participants do you have peak on that pool across all the conferences that it's going to host? In my experience with testing, that actually drives more than just connected users. So if I have 10,000 registered endpoints on my pool's not doing a whole lot. But if I have, say, a couple thousand users that are in AV conferences, that's really going to be my driver and what I'm going to need to look at to scale the environment. So that's something you can get out of CDR, and you can also just get it out of instrumentation. So I'll talk a little bit about performance collections, which is key to sizing your environment. And I know in there's a great instrumentation bucket or performance bucket that actually shows you what the peak conference users is. It'll show you how many participants you have. And that'll be a key one to look at. So lastly, we'll talk about the stress agent. So I actually corrected this slide. So in Lync 2010, we could do 2,500 users that we could simulate. And when I say simulate, I mean simulating all the modalities. We could do one of those per virtual guest or physical stress agent if that's what you're using to test. So these are really going to start to scale. You really have to think about, okay, how many agents am I going to need to have in my environment to be able to test the scale that I need to test? So this is something that's pretty important to look at. Then just going over some of the Hyper-V config notes. This is, again, a little bit of review from Campbell's session. He goes into a lot more depth on this, so if you watch his recording, would be a great idea. But these are some of the highlights. CPU ratio must be 1-to-1. So this really gets into the second point, which is oversubscribing. You do not want to oversubscribe your processors. This can wreak havoc with performance and quality in your environment. And so you want to map a processor core specifically to one of your Lync servers. And more specifically, you want to map 12 of them. So, and that is the recommended. Now, again, I'll emphasize, because this was a big point yesterday, it all depends on your profile. So to your question before, how do I look at it? And getting that data from the performance instrumentation, you might be able to get away with fewer cores. And I'll go into how you make sure that your system is still healthy if you're not able to meet that, say, 12-core requirement on the front ends. So memory, big thing, don't use dynamic memory. You want to dedicate 32 gigs or 16 gigs, depending on what the role is, to those guests. Network, recommendation is you dedicate a network per Lync guest. The recommendation is having a 1 gig NIC that you have for Lync server. That's physical, and then we also translate that to the virtual.
Might want to add too is that you have a dedicated NIC for the host as well, for obvious reasons. All right.
Exactly. There's two different adapter types that you can use. You can use legacy or synthetic. Synthetic is really what you want to use in this case. It gives you more direct access to your network adapter. Legacy, you're gonna get some overhead if you use a legacy adapter, and so you're not going to get the performance out of a legacy adapter that you would out of synthetic. I don't know the specifics on the overhead. Do you have any guidance on that? It's a pretty big hit, the difference between the two adapters.
Top of mind, no.
Okay. And then lastly, disk. Recommended that we use a dedicated disks. Specifically fixed virtual disks. Using the dynamic disks can also cause performance. As we all know, Lync is very sensitive to I/O, and you're going to get some performance degradation if you allow it to kind of resize that disk and as for the requirements. So definitely recommend using fixed disks. There we go. So getting into the actual tooling. So the first tool you're going to want to look at is the user provisioning tool. This is how you create your users. It's how you enable them for Lync and provision them for the different options, the modalities that you want to attach to those users. It's going to generate your contact lists, which is can be a very big driver depending on how many contacts you have in your environment. And again, you're going to want to need to look at things like CDR or your backend database to go, okay, well, this is my average contacts per user. And then, because specifically the average contacts is definitely going to increase your subscriptions per user. So that's going to drive process utilization on your front ends. So this is a key number to look at. If you have a lot of contacts in your environment, you're definitely going to want to look at that and then mimic that in the stress tool so that you actually see the correct CPU load. I'll make a point here, and it's not something that you can test with the provisioning tool, but I want to point it out because it's definitely a driver, and that's federated and pick contacts, because they don't use batch subscriptions, are going to be more of a driver from a subscription perspective. You guys know what a batch subscription is? Anyone? So a batch subscription basically is if I'm a user and I'm on pool 1, and then you have 2 pools, you have another set of users on pool 2, and I add a bunch of contacts to my contact list, all the users, if I'm on pool 1 that I add that are on pool 2, I'm going to batch subscribe to those users rather than sending a single subscription for every single one of those users. So this is good to know. It's a huge performance gain. It was something I think that we shipped in 2010, but it's good to point out. But still, federated contacts, even if they exist in the same domain, say you have a bunch of HP contacts or Microsoft contacts and you're federated with them, we're still going to send these individual subscriptions. So just a good thing to think about. Go ahead. There is a way to delete the users, and so I'll show that when I actually demo this tool. We'll actually go and take a look at it. But there's a create user and a delete user. So there is some cleanup that you can do for the test users that you generate. No, Campbell, can you think of anything that?
No, but I'm just thinking that generally you're in this controlled environment, and most recommendations is that you pull it down and then rebuild it to go into production, just in case. All right, there's always something that maybe it's a registry setting change or something you forgot that wasn't documented. It's actually better to pull it down and then rebuild it. Then if you know you've missed something, so when you do subsequent pulls, you've got that check, right? You got that. Okay, did we do anything funky that was happening in that test scenario? So I definitely would recommend it.
And then the second tool, and we'll go into this a little more depth in the demo, is the actual link load configuration tool. And this is where you're going to generate your profile. What does my usage profile look like? Things like how many conferences do I have that are 5 participant? How many conferences do I have that are kind of large? And then you say in the tool what those look like. So is my large conferences, are they 10 users, or are my large conferences more like 50 or 100 users? And those are the kind of configurations you can put in this tool that the tool will then actually simulate. And this goes in just a little more about being mindful of what features you enable. Every feature you enable in this link configuration tool is going to map to more usage, and is going to map to more utilization on those services. So knowing, again, what your users are doing. Are they using application sharing? Are they doing a lot of data collaboration? Are they doing a lot of video? These are going to be really key things to plug into this tool and make sure you have as much data as you can to feed into it so that when you run these simulators, you actually get pretty real world to your environment what the load's going to look like. Go ahead.
So just to run this tool before the deployment or just one time? How that works?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your question.
So just to run this stress tool before the deployment or in the QA or?
So after you've deployed your environment, it's going to need to be completely configured, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Because you're actually going to want to, before you ever run this tool, you're going to want to build up this environment. You're going to want to make sure it's fully functional. Because the tool, it's really hard to see that you're having a failure in a configuration. Like you've misconfigured something in Lync, and then you run this tool. It's going to be really hard to detect that misconfiguration, and you might completely miss a scenario because it's not being tested because it's not configured properly. So you want to make sure everything is deployed, is ready, is configured, and then you've actually taken a test user, logged them into Lync 2013, and tested those modalities yourself.
And you need any special kind of permission to Active Directory? So it's going to create a users, right?
Yes. So when you run the user provisioning tool, it's going to run it from your contacts, so however you're logged into the system. So you're going to want to make sure you have those Lync permissions to create them, and that you have the AD permissions to actually generate the users. So yeah, it's a very good point. This thing isn't going to help you with permissioning. It's going to expect that your permissioning is set up properly. So you're going to have to be a Lync admin, you're going to have to be a domain admin, or you're going to have your domain admin run the tool. So, all right, so let's take a look at the actual tools here. Go ahead.
So isn't the recommendation to actually do this in a non-production Active Directory as well?
That's correct.
Yes. Yeah, I would highly recommend that. And then you can actually see things, if it's interesting to you, what the domain controller impact is. I mean, so if I deploy a domain controller that maps to what the SKU that on the hardware that I normally use for my domain controller, I can see what my authentication load is going to be from Lync, and then additively look at if that's going to impact my Active Directory environment. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, you want it to be a controlled environment. Yeah, you don't want any artificial or any other introduction of traffic, users. It will skew your results essentially, right? So because you've got to establish a baseline first with no users on it, and then start working through with the stress tool. You may start initially just testing modalities. You may want to, similar to what we did in the lab, we actually cranked it right up, multiple users, very high number, and then see what happens if it falls over, which falls over first. Then start scaling back, changing your modalities to suit your environment. So yeah, that's a good point.
So this is the user provisioning tool. This is the tool that creates all the users, create the contact lists. So you can see here that the information that you're going to need to know what your pool FQDN is, because it needs to obviously assign these users to a home pool. If you're testing more than one pool, you're going to need to run this multiple times. You're going to have to change this configuration, create those users for one pool, and then change it again, and then create the users on the other pool. And then you can see the phone numbers are generated sequentially. And so this can actually be hard if you're trying to use like a production environment. It's better when you're not using real numbers here, because most of the time it's really hard to go, well, here's a 1,000 user block that I have that's contiguous, and most environments don't have that. Most of the time it's peppered all over the place, and the tool doesn't really operate well with that. You'll end up running this tool just tons and tons of times trying to fill in all those gaps. So that's one reason to kind of isolate this kind of testing. And then to the question before, this is how you would delete those users after the fact. You can see there's a create and a delete. And this is your contact creation. Hopefully I can get this demo quickly. So this is going to say, like, what's my average contacts? What are my average contact groups per user? So how many groups do these users have? And then talk about the cross-pool contact percentage, how many of my contacts are in one pool versus the other pool, and then how many federated contacts I have. I don't know if we tested the federated contacts in our case for the Lync white paper, but again, it's something that's very important to look at, like I said, because it's going to definitely increase processor utilization on your front ends. And then you go into things like your distribution lists and configuring those. It's going to basically create them with a prefix. That's the same as the test users. They're all created with the prefix test user 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. And then your kind of Liz configuration. If you're using Liz configuration, you can supply those details here. And it'll actually generate those config files. So then the other tool is this Lync load configuration tool. This is going to be the key one that you're going to want to bring as much data as you can about what your usage profile looks across your environment. Very, very key to bring as much information in here so that you get as much information back when you start looking at what the load looks like after you run these tests. So you can see here we can accommodate multiple machines. Like I said before, we have 4,500 users simulated per agent. And this machines is talking about how many agents you need. And so you just scale by 4,500, and then you can decide how many machines that you need to allocate for the testing. This also goes into what your username prefix is. This maps to what the provisioning tool, what you put in that tool. You want to make sure that gets populated in here. And then you'll see some of the other information like the network settings for internal and external. This is essentially service discovery. How are these test users going to discover the service? You're just going to put things, you can put sip.contosa.com if that's what you're using for service discovery. Or if you want to just point them directly at a pool because you're not testing service discovery or it doesn't matter in your environment, you can just put the pool name right in here. And if you are dealing with multiple pools, the beauty of Lync is if I don't hit my home pool, no matter what pool I hit, I'm going to get redirected to my home pool. So don't worry about if I have 5 or 6 pools that I'm testing. And then we'll go into the general scenarios. So these are a little can be a little confusing. So the first thing you look at is you have this low, medium, and high in custom. So what low, medium, high means is low is, we'll start with the high side. So high is basically max load for these stress agents. So it's going to put the maximum amount of load on the server, and we'll get into what that looks like in the advanced configuration. Medium is 60% of the high. Low is 30% of the high. And then custom, if you select that, you can go in here and you select external as things like I'm going to have external users that I want to simulate. I'm going to have instant message conferencings that I'm going to simulate, and then I'm going to have large conferences that I'm going to simulate, and you can select which one of those apply. I'm not going to go into all the detail. There's a lot of configuration that you can put into this tool, and again, this is why it's so important to bring as much data as you can to the table from CDR, from instrumentation that you have, so you can fill out these items. But like I said, it gets into a lot of granularity. If you go into these advanced options and you make changes, you have to make sure that you're on custom. If you're not on custom, it's not going to take any of these values. So just make sure that you select custom, go and modify it, or you're going to put all that data in there and it's not going to get used. So you can see we have things like conversations per hour. We have IM messages sent per minute. These are all pieces of information that you can get from CDR. But if you don't have this information available, I would suggest at least starting with the usage model that we have published on TechNet. That, in my opinion, is kind of on the high side. A lot of customers don't meet that usage model bar as far as the load, but it's a good place to start if you just can't get that data. Yes?
Do you have any of these settings which is equal to the default use model? If you review, is that
Well, so in our testing, we did custom across the board, and we actually spent a lot of time taking the usage model and mapping it to this configuration, and it's in the white paper. And so we literally in the appendix and the first white paper, not the testing guide, but
Yep. The first, and we use the default user profile. We explain basically the various settings. We also show in red where we've changed the settings and explain why. So it gives you, and you saw if you came yesterday, we had only a 3 front-end pool in our lab. So we had to make some changes to adjust to allow for that because of the limitations of the hardware that we had in the lab. So we do explain specifically why we made some changes to help you. Okay, that's what they changed that for. Because a lot of the time, as Seth mentioned, you're not going to be running at the full default user profile because it is aimed very high or considerably high.
Yeah, but all these settings, the IMS sent per minute,
Yep.
Does that equals the default use model?
In the documentation for the default user profile and the link, they actually marry it up. They explain in the documentation that does that, yeah.
But it's not, and just to clarify, there are a lot of things we did change. So these defaults don't map to the defaults in the usage profile.
There you go.
Yeah. And it's one of the main reasons why we put it in there, because we spent actually a couple days trying to map the usage profile to these configurational elements. And it is challenging, which is why we put it in the doc. Okay. And then you can see that all the modalities here, you kind of have these same options. You're going to see low, medium, high, and you're going to see custom. And then you can disable the modalities. If you don't have one of these modalities deployed, say you're using a conferencing policy and you have application sharing disabled, you can disable it in the tool. This tool does test voice and PSTN connectivity, so it will actually simulate inbound PSTN calls and outbound PSTN calls. So you can simulate your voice over IP load if you do have enterprise voice deployed in your Lync environment. Or you can leave these options disabled if you haven't gotten that far yet in your deployment. The one thing to note here, and I actually looked at this last night because I wanted to make sure, so these PSTN simulators, they run on the stress agents. So there is a test that runs on that stress agent, which means that you can't necessarily test PSTN, say if I'm on the gateway side. Say I actually want to bring my gateway into the mix, and I want to test stress on that gateway, and that gateway is married up with mediation servers. This tool is not going to work that way. It's going to actually just send calls to the mediation server directly, so you're not going to be able to test things like gateway load. So that's just good to note. I did look, and there are some other PSTN simulators out there. We haven't tested them yet, but there might be some options if you want to do more end-to-end PSTN testing and load testing and involve SPCs or gateways into that. And again, we go through these different modalities. You'll see, again, we stick with this low, medium, high. They're all, like I said, max 60%, 30%, or disabled. Some of the things to note, like with the reach client, and I'll go into this with the XML, the SIP-auth method is default to Kerberos. And this is one thing you'll see that we changed in our environment because if I'm a reach client, more than likely I'm out on the internet, and I'm not going to be able to go and talk to my domain controller to be able to get our Kerberos token. So I'm going to use NTLM. So you're going to want to go in here and you're going to want to change this to NTLM. If that's your case. Now, maybe you're an isolated environment, you don't have remote access, and you can use Kerberos, you're more than welcome to use the default. But I think in a lot of cases, you're going to want to change this one. Then we go into the mobility. The things to think about, too, are there are pieces of information. Like in the first page, we saw that there was the service discovery that we had to configure. Well, we all know there's also UCWA service discovery that we have to deal with for mobile clients. And so you want to make sure you put these URLs in here, or nothing's going to get tested. So this is another case where if you don't go in here and configure all these options properly, it can be really hard to troubleshoot that these tests aren't actually working because they're all simulated. And so it's very important. And it's also very important to test mobility in your environment to make sure that you are actually getting to or logging in through a mobile client. Oh, yeah. See, it doesn't like it when you don't configure these options. Go. Yeah, so luckily sometimes in this tool you'll actually get some errors if it needs something from you and to configure, but you won't actually see it unless you go into that configurational page. The mobility client is the only one I've actually seen that, where if you try to not configure some options, it'll actually error out because it can't run those tests without that config. So that's actually a pretty good feature of the tool. So then the last thing is it gives you this summary page. It tells you what the user ranges are going to be for each one of these tests I selected. So you saw I enabled instant messaging in the very first page. So it actually tells you, hey, test user 0 through 940 is going to be involved in that testing for conferencing. External is going to use 940 to 11,000. And so it actually tells me, hey, these are the users that are going to be doing these testing. So it can be helpful if you are trying to troubleshoot that you know which users are involved in what testing. And then you just generate a file. You can, this run client.bat is going to generate a batch file, which is an easy way to go and execute and run all the tests. Or you can just generate the files, and there's a way to run the tests individually. And I have a slide that kind of shows you what that syntax looks like. So I'm not going to generate the files here. I've already done that. And so here is an example of what you're going to see once it generates the files. You're going to see client 0, and if you have more than one machine that's in more than one agent test machine, you're going to see a folder per test machine. The idea is that you copy that folder over to those test machines that are respective of who they are. So I don't want to have client 0 running on more than one stress agent. I want to make sure that I copy the specific folder to that stress agent and execute that configuration. This is important because you don't want stress user agent 1 trying to log in and simulate test user 1, and also another stress agent trying to log in and test user 1. It's going to try to keep those separate. And in these files, you're going to see all the configuration. So each one of these XMLs reflects a selection in the user configuration load tool. Oh, darn it. I love demos. Grab some power here.
Do you want me to hook that up?
Yeah. So real quick, while I'm hooking that up, I want to show you guys a couple more things, but we'll go back to the deck here, and I'm going to talk about a couple more of the items for the test tool. So this kind of talks about some of our testing methodology. The first thing, and I think it's here. Emphasize this, you want to make sure your environment's functional. You want to make sure all these modalities that you're trying to test is actually configured and working, and that you have a control client, as we like to call them, that's actually operating in all these different modalities. I highly suggest when you run these simulator tools that you run them for 24 hours. The test tools are really good at generating random load based on your configuration. And so you're going to have ebbs and flows of users coming into conferences and leaving conferences, new conferences being generated, large conferences, mid-sized conferences. And so it's very good to just run that for a full 24 hours, and you're going to see all that load. Run the test twice. I mean, I think this is a good idea in any testing you're doing. You want to make sure that if I run the test for 24 hours, everything looks good. I want to run it again because I want to make sure that I can deploy that same exact configuration and that I'm not going to see anything change. And then use a control client. Now, I said you want to make sure your environment's functional when you're running, but you also want to make sure that while you're running the test and while you're generating all this load in the environment, that I have a couple test machines that I can go and start a conference, that I can and try to make a UC to UC call. Because that's a really easy way for me to know under load of the environment that I'm not running into some quality issues that I'm not seeing in instrumentation. Maybe when I try to generate a conference and I try to join it, it's taking 15 to 20 seconds to join that conference. But I'm for some reason not seeing that in my instrumentation. This is a really good way to see the perspective of the user. So I highly recommend these control clients. And using as many as you can, as many people as you have. Like if optimally you have 3, so that you can test all the modalities across Lync with those 3 users and just make sure that things, for one, are working, but also they're working at quality and at the quality bar you're expecting. So let's jump back and finish the taking a look at the tool here. So like I was mentioning, these are all the XML files that are generated from that load configuration tool, and each one of these is going to be a specific modality that you're testing. So if you have something disabled in the load configuration tool, it is not going to generate an XML file for it. So the amount of XML files that you're going to see is going to vary depending on what you enable. In this case, I've enabled everything, so you guys can see all the XML files that are generated. And I'll show you an example of one. This is the reach IM. And you can see that all those values that were mapped in the UI are now mapped in this XML file. And you can go and look at them in more granularity if you would like to. And again, this is actually the XML that we used in our lab. So you can see we actually have this NTLM selection set. Now, one thing, and that this should be in the white paper. I haven't made sure that it made it out in the final one yet. But the reason I wanted to show you this XML for the Reach IM client is there was something that we found as a undocumented feature, and that there are multiple conversation configurations that get generated with Reach IM. And if you have both of these enabled at the same time, which is the default config, then it's going to run into some simulation error states where you're going to be essentially trying to duplicate tests with the Reach IM client, and you're going to run into conflicts. And what it's going to look like when you look at your KHIs is all of your front ends are going to hit 100% utilization on proc if you have both of these enabled at the same time. This took us a long time to figure out what was going on here. So what we did, and you're definitely going to want to do this in your environment when you're using this tool, is we disabled this UCWA common configuration. So you're going to want to make sure you do that in your lab. Any other questions, things you want to see in these tools? Okay. Let's go back to the deck here. Oh, go ahead. So you can. You can go into this tool and you can only enable, say, the conferencing modality. What you're going to have to do is, so in your environment, are you talking about, I have this, say, a set of conferencing organizers, and they're the only users that are going to live on that conferencing pool, and then everybody else is going to be on some other pools? Yeah, so what you would want to do is just that. You would want to have two pools in your environment. You'd want to generate all those users on one pool. And I'm trying to think of how well that's going to work in the config, actually. But yeah, it should work. The one thing that you might run into that you're going to have to change in the XML is that if you remember the summary slide, it told you what users were doing what testing, and it's going to generate that. And that gets generated and put into these XML files that I showed you just a second ago. And so you are probably going to have to go in there and tell it what specific users you're going to want to run those tests, or it's going to generate those conferences with users that are on the other pool. So that's actually kind of a hard scenario to test, but if you go in and modify the users, you should be able to do that. And then you go into the conferencing configuration, and you actually say, hey, these are the conference sizes that I want to test. If you're trying to test like a 100-person conference, then you just want to go and make that configuration. But just make sure you go into the XML and actually tell it what users specifically, or it's not going to put the right users in that test scenario. But yeah, that's actually a really good scenario. So running the test, the link load configuration. So like I said, you're going to see these directories that are generated after you finish your configuration and run the tool, generate the files. You're going to want to then copy each one of these directories to their respective agent. And then you're going to run them using this syntax. Now, this syntax is essentially a copy of what's in TechNet. There's actually fairly good documentation on TechNet for both the Lync 2010 stress tool, which there is one, and the Lync 2013 stress tool. How many people in the room are running Lync 2010 still and don't have a 2013 environment? Okay. So one thing I'll note, and I actually changed this in my deck because I made a mistake. In 2010, the scaling unit for the load configuration agents is 2,500. In 2013, they upped that with some performance enhancements to 4,500. So it's just good to note that. But as far as how you run the tool and everything, it's the same. I didn't see any differences in the syntax between the 2010 performance tool and the 2013 performance tool. And this last piece here is kind of interesting, and this can be a really good way to take a look at what modalities are generating what load. And we did a lot of this when we were doing our testing, specifically when we were trying to troubleshoot the reach-IM issue that we were having. Is we would go in and we would individually execute these tests. So we would only run the reach-IM test, and we would see what that looked like when we started looking at performance collections. And it was actually quite insightful to see, hey, when I execute that reach-IM test, whoop, my proc goes way up. And that's how we were able to identify where our configuration issue was. You can also use that same idea and look at, hey, when I start that reach-IM test and I simulate that reach load that I put in the configuration tool, this is how much it's going to increase my utilization on my procs. It's going to, with my configuration, I'm going to see a 20 or a 30% increase in my processor utilization on my front ends. So this can be some really great data when you're deciding, when somebody in your organization asks you, well, we want to deploy AV conferencing, or we want to go do this new modality, and you now need to see if this environment that you've deployed can handle that, or if you need to add a front end or add a whole nother pool. So it's very powerful to run these individual tests. I highly recommend playing with them. So this is getting into the performance monitoring. We used specifically the key health indicators to generate the performance collections that we looked at after we ran the tests. And so you can see in the key health indicators, which I hope everybody has looked at. If you haven't, there's a link to it in this deck when they finally publish them out, or you can literally just go and do a search on Bing for key health indicators for Lync 2013, and you're going to find this on TechNet. You see it's kind of split up into two categories. We have service health at the top. So these are all pieces of instrumentation that let me know that my Lync environment is healthy. Things like my health for my MCU state, what my response drops are, what my latencies are, which is probably the most important thing to look at in a Lync environment. That's my opinion, but I think most people would agree with that the disk issues and my ability to get from my front end to my back end when I'm trying to run sprocs against my back end database. If I have a lot of latency there, that can indicate a network problem. Or if it's local, if I'm trying to access databases on my front end and I'm seeing high queue latencies, then that's probably a disk contention issue. And you need to look in and see if you need to increase your disks, increase your arrays.
To add, in the white paper, in the first white paper, Planning and Architecture, we actually indicate the top 10 critical KHIs to watch first. And then from that, if you detect that there's an issue within those top 10 critical KHIs, you can then start drilling down into about 80-odd KHIs that you can then go and start doing further analysis. And obviously, you want to look at both anyway, just to make sure that your environment is healthy, but it's important to note that there are some sort of like glaring, obvious, KHIs if they're hitting a certain point. CPU utilization, proc utilization is one. If it's constantly high, then what else is causing that? It's trying to sort of be a detective and do root cause analysis and start dropping down and looking into the various KHIs.
Yeah, I'm very happy to see that we produced this for Lync 2013. I mean, this is obviously usable for physical and virtual, whatever you're looking at from a Lync perspective. I don't know if you're like me, but when I first started deploying things like OCS 2007 and Lync 2010, and I looked at the performance instrumentation that got loaded by those applications, I was overwhelmed by how much was there. It was like, okay, what's important? What's not important? There's hundreds of them. And it's hard to know what to really look at and drill down in. So this is a great way to look at, I think you said 80 performance collections, so it really reduces down what you have to look at, which is nice when you, say, want to create a performance collection that's just running on that front end all the time. So you can go and look at the health. You can use these key health indicators to generate that perf collection, which is really cool. And then just the second, this purple section is really your utilization, CPU, disk, memory, and network. Those are all part of the KHIs. The one thing to think about here is if, like I was talking about Q latency, if you're seeing high Q latency and you're seeing disk, you have that in your performance collection, those are probably going to map together. So you're actually going to be able to see, hey, I have a disk problem here. I need to add another disk to my array, or I need to upgrade my disks. And here I just kind of translate, hey, this is talking about MCU health state, so this is what the actual counter names would look like if you put them in the performance collection, which is kind of nice to see. All right, so in summary, this is really just kind of what we talked about. Looked at guest requirements and recommendations. We looked at scaling units for the different Lync roles and the user load agent as well. We looked at the stress tool configuration and how you would set that up, possibly using the user model, possibly using CDR to generate what that configuration looks like. And then after you run your tests, you're looking at things like performance monitoring. Hey, I've run these tests now. Now I need to go and look and make sure that the system's still healthy. So using things like the key health indicators to do that. And that's it.